Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's September 29, 2020, and today we are discussing anthropology, masculinity, tea shops and monasteries in the book, The Traffic in Hierarchy, Masculinity and Its Others in Buddhist Burma, researched in the years leading up to 2013 and published in 2017 by the University of Hawai'i Press, with its author, Professor of Anthropology, Ward Keeler of the University of Texas. Hello, Ward.
Hello.
Ward, in your earlier career, you primarily researched society and culture in Indonesia and in Java, and this background occasionally shines through in your later work on Myanmar. So I want to know how and why did you become interested in culturally diverse Myanmar, and then later decide to write a book about Burman Buddhists?
The official answer is that even as an undergraduate at Cornell, which has a very strong Southeast Asia program, I started learning Indonesian. I knew I wanted to go to Indonesia to do fieldwork and so on. But I also thought that it would be very interesting to do comparative work between island and mainland Southeast Asia, because anybody who starts studying Southeast Asia quickly becomes aware of the fact that there are important contrasts and maybe similarities between the areas. So the official answer is that I wanted eventually to be able to do comparative work between the two regions. That's true. It's not the whole truth. The rest of the truth is that my second year as an undergraduate, I was in Paris, where I intended to keep studying Indonesian. But Georges Condaminas, who was sort of the lead Southeast Asianist in Paris at the time, when I went to see him shortly after I got to Paris and said I was planning on going to Langue Orientale for Indonesian, he said, no, don't do that. It's taught by a Russian princess who fled the revolution by going to Malaysia, and had a Malay prince as a lover, or some such story. So he said, no, don't do that. Take Burmese with Madame Bernot, if only for the method. So I thought, oh, okay, sure. So I started Burmese in Paris with Denise Bernot, which was great fun. And then when I got back to Cornell the following fall, I started Burmese over again with the beloved Margaret Afwe. But then, of course, for many years, it was impossible to go to Burma. Ne Win had closed the place down. I did my fieldwork in Indonesia, so on and so forth. But I was actually teaching Javanese at the University of Michigan in the mid-'80s, and word came down that the Fulbright program was being reestablished. So I thought, oh, great. I will now that I've pretty well accomplished as a specialist in Indonesia, now I'll turn back to Burma. I'll take up the study of the language again. So that's what I did. And it made a complete mess of my academic career, I have to say, because for one thing, I kept getting Fulbrights but not getting visas. In the end, quite to my astonishment, the third time, I assumed I would not get the visa, but I did. So I got there in September of 1987, was there in 1988, but it was a long time before I felt I had spent enough time in Burma to really be in a position to write much about it. So it was a long time before I wrote some articles and I made some music recordings, but I didn't write the book until, as you say, it was published in 2017.
Well, that's really interesting that you actually started learning the language all that time before your publications on Java. And like so many academics during those decades, kind of in the wilderness, not easy to get to Myanmar or Burma, as it was then officially known. When you did come to Myanmar in the late 80s, what was it that drew you to, you've published articles about performance and about gender and all kinds of different things in the country. But what was it about Burman Buddhism that drew you to write your book about that?
Well, that's another rather sort of silly story. I went to Burma thinking that I would continue to work in the performing arts, the classical arts, particularly puppetry. Since my dissertation research was about shadow puppets in Java, I thought there was a marionette tradition in Burma, so I was interested in other performing arts. The trouble was that the Burmese government would let me live either at the Fulbright house in Rangoon, which was set up specially for those Fulbrighters that were starting to arrive, or at a hotel, or at a monastery. I didn't want to stay at the Fulbright house in Rangoon. I wanted to be in Mandalay. So, of course, I had no desire to spend months and months living in a hotel. In fact, in Indonesia, I had always lived in villages, lived in families as a boarder with families in villages. So when I got to Mandalay, I, of course, chose to live in monasteries. And although I had actually given a religion a very wide berth in my earlier research, because I found the topic actually quite boring when people started holding forth on the subject of religion, here I was living in a monastery, and actually a series of monasteries, and I thought, okay, I guess this is going to be my topic. And of course, I eventually realized that I didn't have to steep myself in the esoteric Pali canon and all of that. I could instead take this community as further instances of social relations, which is what ultimately was my focus in Java, even if I got there through the performing arts. So then that was what I did. I just chatted with people living in and around this monastery to learn about social relations in Burma.
All right. Before we get into the content of the book, we're almost there, but I just want to ask about this time staying in the monasteries. Could you tell us a little bit about that and like your routines as a sort of special resident? I'm guessing you were not ordained. How did you manage to research and then like write your experiential knowledge into a book from that time?
I was perfectly clear to everybody that I am not a Buddhist. I had no intention of becoming a Buddhist or becoming a monk. But something that I try to demonstrate in my description of the monastery is that it is a realm in which you do what you think you should do. So if I wanted to spend my days studying, reading, chatting, going getting tea at the tea shop, it was completely up to me. The good thing is that it's a complicated story, but the first monastery I stayed in Mandalay, which was in 87, 88, was quite an old-fashioned monastery. And I got to know how a monastery worked. Then when I went back in 2011, this very famous abbot, the Tirigu Siadwa, very graciously suggested that I could stay at one of his network of monasteries in Mandalay, which was quite luxurious and seemed like a very good idea at first. There were well over 100 monks and nuns who came every day for classes, but actually very few monks lived there. And I actually, in a sense, got thrown out. The abbot of that particular monastery clearly took a dislike to me. I believe he took a dislike to all foreigners, as a matter of fact. I don't think I personally committed any egregious acts such that he no longer wanted me there. From the day I got there, he never once greeted me. He never once acknowledged my existence as we passed by. Anyway, I was forced to leave, which after 3 months, which I found very distressing at the time. It turned out to be a great thing because I went to a prestigious monastery, but a much more typical monastery in the middle of town. And the great news was that although the actual abbot of the monastery was a very taciturn, quite remote figure, quite appropriately for an abbot. So he really personified the detached authority. The number 3 position at that monastery was an enormously talky, chatty, friendly monk who loved nothing better than to have me wander in any time of the late afternoon or evening and just sit and talk with him. And this turned out to be an absolute godsend. He was far and away the person that I learned the most from. So my day consisted of getting up and doing some reading, maybe going into town on my bicycle and visiting friends or whatever else, but then certainly spending much of most days talking with this particular monk and other monks living in the monastery.
You mentioned that you would go to tea shops during your fieldwork, and I thought maybe we could use the tea shop, as you do in the book, to kind of explain. You say that tea shops are a good place. They're ubiquitous in urban Myanmar, and they're a good place to see how hierarchical understandings pervade social relations. So, in what we may call desiccating social science terms, what do you mean by hierarchy, and how are tea shops examples of its function?
That's 2 different questions. So let me start with hierarchy, because tea shops exemplify hierarchy in some ways and exemplify departures from hierarchy in others. But let me start by saying hierarchy is an ideal type. We understand, as English speakers, most of us think of hierarchy referring only to inequality. It's true that inequality is an inevitable component of hierarchy, but that's not the point. What hierarchy really is this exchange relationship across difference. So gender difference or class difference or any other difference. It is, however, always between necessarily that one party to the exchange will enjoy greater prestige than the other. That's just the way it works. The nature of the arrangement is that because of whatever difference there is between the 2 parties to the exchange, the obligations and privileges enjoyed by or imposed upon, incumbent upon each of the parties also differs. Subordinates offer up labor and deference, service and deference. And superordinates, we normally call superiors, give down, bestow upon their subordinates material gifts, some degree of recognition, whatever the subordinate needs. And it's very fuzzy. What's absent from all of this is rights. Everybody has both obligations and privileges. Nobody has rights. I just think that's important to keep in mind to really understand the logic of the whole system. And you see this in all kinds of relationships in Burma. In fact, I would say in a lot of places, certainly throughout Southeast Asia. And it is thought to be in everybody's interest, because subordinates need access to the wealth, the material wealth that their superiors have access to. So they're dependent, but in light of their needs, they find it in no way humiliating or demeaning to offer up respect and whatever jobs need to be done. So any powerful, prestigious person in Burma will be surrounded by a coterie of people of lesser status. We might call them flunkies, but if we call them flunkies, that displays our disrespect. They do not necessarily, as I say, feel humiliated by subordinating themselves to the powerful. And I become impatient with outsiders who are always assuming that people who are, here's the term I would use, forgive me, the structurally weaker position. Outsiders always want to find that they, of course, reject the entire system and they resist it for all they're worth, though, of course, the poor victims of this oppression have no choice but to knuckle under. The fact is, of course, nobody's happy with the exchange relations they find themselves in. They never think that the other party is fulfilling their obligations as they should be. So there's ceaseless complaining. But resistance suggests that they actually reject the whole system. I don't think that's true. I think that people, as I say, are quite willing to subordinate themselves with the understanding that the people to whom they subordinate will cast down to them what they need. And of course, it's very hard to constrain superiors. It's easier to constrain subordinates, though it's never that easy. So superiors also spend all of the time complaining about how their subordinates are not fulfilling their obligations. As I say, I'm describing an ideal type, which in actual life is all very complex and takes many different forms. The interesting thing about a tea shop is that the customers at a tea shop, most of whom are male, not exclusively, but most of them, when they enter a tea shop, they decide what they want. They tell some, almost always a young boy, although it's getting to be fashionable to hire slightly older women, so women in their late teens or early 20s. Anyway, you tell whoever is nearby what you want, and they bring you what you ordered. But if you want something else, so you've eaten your noodles, now you want a cup of tea, any other of the young people hanging around, waiting to take another order, do the same. In other words, there is no ongoing relationship between the customer and any particular server. But what's flattering to the status of the customer is they have no further obligations to the server. Tipping's impossible in this situation. How would you tip? Could be, if you stay there long enough, you could be working with 5 different servers and other people are going to clear the table. The way that the servers know how much you need to pay is they just look at the dishes left on the table and they can figure it out. So this is, I think, a kind of meeting point between hierarchical relationships in which there's a clear differentiation of status, granting the greatest autonomy, freedom of action to the superior, the customer. But it's like free market exchange in that there is no ongoing relationship. The superior owes no individual server anything. All the superior owes is payment at the end of the series of transactions. So what I see in these, as far as I know, unique arrangements in Burmese tea shops, I've never encountered anything like this elsewhere, is this resolution of the contradiction between the desire for autonomy and the desire at the same time to enjoy all the benefits of a hierarchical exchange relationship. I'm not sure I made that as clear as I should have in my book, but it seems to me increasingly characteristic of Burma, and also for that matter, I have to say Indonesia, which is to say the hierarchical relationships are much less satisfying to a great many people, but it's the wealthy elite that is pulling out of them, not the people that wish to subordinate themselves in order to enjoy the benefits of higher long-term relationships of exchange, which is something that happened in the West a while back when we moved to market exchange, to disembedded exchange relations.
That's really cool. That's given us a great description of a very compelling way of understanding social relations in Myanmar and outside of the monastery. But now, going back to the more explicit subject of your book, which are Bama Buddhists, I want to start with a question about gender. And after more than 4 years of this podcast, incredibly, I've never asked this question before. So it's my great pleasure to give you the honor, Ward. You're the right man or person. Now, monks in the Burmese language are most often referred to as Pongji or Big Pone. Pone is a really pervading and fascinating concept in Myanmar society. And Burmese people use it to describe and justify behavior, hierarchy, and so much in society. So the question is, what is bone? Where does it come from? How does it work?
Needless to say, it is complicated and hard to define. It's hard to translate into a single term. Pone is usually thought of as the reward that men enjoy in light of their karmic merits, the merits that they have accumulated, which simply by virtue of the fact that they were born male indicates already that their karmic merits have accumulated to a greater degree than individuals who are born as females. Now, if you wanted to look for a single word, maybe the word glory would be appropriate, but I don't know. The fact is that it's some sort of grounds for prestige that males have and females don't. That's simply a Buddhist, or at least a Burman Buddhist understanding of one of the differences between males and females. And it is because males have this pone, it is incumbent upon females to demonstrate their respect for the greater pone of any male. But of course, not every male has as much pone. I mean, there's nothing equalizing about it, so that certain males are seen to enjoy, to be in possession of more pone than other males. And monks ipso facto have more pone than a lay man, at least theoretically. Of course, in practice, a garden variety novice is not really thought of as having a great deal of pone. The abbot of a monastery has immense amounts of pone and will win great respect and many signs of deference, and also many donations of food, money, whatever else, service, out of respect for his great pone and the expectation that in return for donating whatever, he, as the possessor of great pone, will be able to give great karmic merit to the donor. It's still an exchange relationship. It's not exactly euphemized. It's just that what goes up is material as well as signs of respect. And what comes down from the pone is spiritual. It is merit.
And you used the example of a novice and an abbot, which got me thinking about the temporal aspect. That abbot used to be a novice and probably was not recognized for having much pone at that time. So how much is all of this relational, and do people explain it that way, or did the abbot always have the pone?
Of course, novices garner relatively little respect because they're young and they're not terribly accomplished in any way. If even a novice demonstrates particularly skills at, for example, memorizing great swaths of the Pali Canon, then he will already be singled out and thought of as already in possession of more pone than your average novice. But really, it is as a novice becomes a monk in his 20th year, so when he's 19, and then as he proceeds, he will be observed to stand in ever greater possession of pone. That depends partly on how much of the Pali Canon he memorizes. It can also depend on things like how effectively he can give religious talks to the public. It may mean how effective he is at running a monastery. There are different ways in which he can demonstrate his pone. The standard method, though, the most orthodox, is by learning great swaths of the Pali Canon, thereby, one, taking ever more difficult examinations on his knowledge of the Pali Canon, And eventually, such as the abbot in the monastery I lived longest in Mandalay, he was very well known throughout Burma because he could test other monks about their knowledge of the Pali Canon because he was so knowledgeable. And so he would be flown around Burma to subject monks to these tests. Now, there is one other element to this. Increasingly, monks who are famous for their meditation are also believed to be in possession of great poems. The curious thing about this is, to be famous for your meditation, you have to go out off into very remote places and meditate for very long periods of time. But then you cannot be a mover and shaker, either among monks or in Burmese society at large. So what happens for the very famous monks is that they are known to have spent a great period of time out in the wilderness meditating alone. Now they have come back into the world, but the great poem remains with them.
Turning to lay people on this topic, and also touching on something that you write about pretty extensively in the book, which is the preconceptions that especially people from Western or egalitarian ideological societies take with them, and the challenges of understanding hierarchy. I find that poem is used as an argument by Burmese people to stop me from doing nice things for them. If I was going to characterize it, that's the way I would do it. For example, washing a woman's clothes for her. I'm not allowed to do that because it would diminish my poem. From my point of view, my argument would be, well, if I have this poem, can I not exercise it and, gain happiness because you are busy? I would like to wash your clothes for my glory. No, it's not allowed. It's very challenging to understand and interact with on a daily basis in the lay world.
If you engage in behavior that is inappropriate to your status, you are not demonstrating what a good guy you are. You are demonstrating your lack of awareness of the obligations as well as the privileges of your status. For you to compromise your poem by washing a woman's clothes, let alone her undergarments, that it simply makes no sense. It is a completely foolish act, and one that should make you feel deeply ashamed. You should feel anade, this famous term, shared throughout Southeast Asia. I know 4 Southeast Asian languages. It's a very important word in all of them. And another word that's hard to translate, it's usually translated shame. Clifford Geertz famously said for Balinese, it means stage fright. That's the best translation, which is interesting. And I would say it's not nearly as catchy, but I think it really refers to demonstrating your awareness of your own status relative to the status of the people you're with. A very roundabout definition. But for you to do something like that, to wash a woman's clothes, means that you have no sense of your own status and how you must maintain it. And let's say that because of who you are as an adult male, other people depend upon you. They depend upon you in part because you have great poem. If you start compromising your poem, you're not just doing yourself a disservice, you're doing all of your subordinates a disservice. So nobody's going to thank you for this absurd gesture that you're making.
All right. And thinking about maintaining status and comportment, we've all who've been to Myanmar or seen Myanmar documentaries, news, have seen the long lines of monks walking down the street, very austere, and seem to be keeping their status, which is in part as a wearing the robes, so symbols of the Buddha. And you get into some really great meaty stuff in your book, talking about these monks who, although you've mentioned nuns, are always men. So you claim the two things that a Buddhist monk must never do if he is to fulfill the major obligations that his status imposes on him are: 1, engage in sex, and 2, earn money, but especially engage in sex. So in most societies, and in Myanmar, outside religious contexts, having sex and making money are looked at, you say, as defining features of masculine identity. You think that we must ask, therefore, how it is that masculinity can be idealized without apparent inconsistency in two contradictory ways. So that is by maximizing or minimizing both sex and productivity. So this is really interesting. How is that so? And what is it? Why does sex matter so much?
Yes, always an important question everywhere. What is the deal about sex? So the fact is that both sex and making money should be in hierarchical societies, including Burma, and this is very much the case in Indonesia as well, I would say, that a man demonstrates his potency, really that's the word in English, he demonstrates his potency by being sexually athletic and making scads of money. He shouldn't make his money really by going out and working hard and being your average trader. That does not flatter anybody's status. But if money just comes his way, that's a sign of his glory, his pone in a way, certainly of his power. And having lots of sex and proving it by having lots of kids demonstrates his virility, another demonstration of power. And it also demonstrates his ability to impose his power upon other people, which is considered a masculine trait, right? Men, power, they go together. They're idealized this way. So the question is, how can it be even more idealized, those men who engage in neither? And I would say that it follows from the fact that if you have sex with a lot of people and make lots of money, that means you control a lot of people. You can exert your power over a lot of other people. But if you can avoid all of that, you demonstrate your ability to control yourself. And that is even more impressive. After all, males especially are seen to be very much given over to their sexual impulses. To be able to triumph over those urges, that's an ongoing struggle. And so a man who can do that, that is truly astonishing. That is clear evidence of a degree of control that is really impressive. And don't forget that the Buddhist message comes down in the end to breaking attachments, breaking investments in the world, which means other people, and it means pleasure. So what is sex if not a demonstration of your investment in pleasure, and with any luck, like your investment in other people? Though, of course, the higher your status in Southeast Asian society, and this is true of Burmese royalty and Burmese generals for that matter, the more women you're expected to have sex with, or even, depending on the court, just the more individuals, no matter what their sex, that didn't really matter. The only important thing was that you were on top. Those demonstrations of sexuality do imply some degree of investment in the world. Well, Buddhism says more glorious still is to have no investments in the world. Doesn't mean being poor, it means deliberately detaching yourself. So it's the ultimate gesture of Buddhist control, is control over the self. And of course, meditation is the ultimate demonstration of such control, right? So it has come to be the most prestigious demonstration of Buddhist piety that there is. It has become enormously popular since the 1950s. has enjoyed ever greater popularity, certainly as something people talk about. I think that what it demonstrates is some shifting in the whole attitude toward religion. And this is something that is not, I think, confined to Theravada Buddhism. I've been reading Charles Taylor's massive book, A Secular Age, just recently. And the pattern seems to be in many places that modernity brings a depersonalization of the demonstrations of one's piety. And so individual action, rather than exchange relations, such as between a layperson and a monk, I think they become more salient as individuals seek religious progress, spiritual advancement, not through their relations with others, such as the Sangha, but indeed for lay people, on their own steam. I would note that women go on meditation retreats in much greater numbers than men do, which takes a certain explaining on the part of men. But actually, what women say is, well, we know men are hopeless at controlling their desires, so they're not really much interested in meditating. But monks, and in Burmese, the word for person and the word for monk are mutually exclusive. So they say, well, Yajadwe, men are hopeless at controlling their desires, but monks, on the contrary, are extremely good at it.
Yeah, so I've been lucky enough to have a few female friends in their 20s and 30s who have gone and done these meditation retreats. And when I've talked to them about it, and while they've been doing it, I've been struck by, I had a sort of take on it. My reading of what they're doing is that it's kind of like a ritual of brinksmanship, where they take themselves out of their family and social life, their partners, etc., etc. And by doing so, they're sort of, they're working on their own personal salvation by meditating a lot, but they're also demonstrating to their normal social worlds their value. And families, constantly text them, say, come back, come back from the monastery, don't leave us, stay there too long. And these women who are on the retreats will, enjoy that a little bit and push it a few more days. And I do think that there's something in it as, if not a primary motivation, like a secondary one. It definitely seems to be part of it.
Yes, absolutely. And the men, when you say, well, have you been on a meditation retreat? And they say no, they justify that fact on the grounds that they're very busy. They're out there working, providing for the family. Whereas all of these women, of course, like nothing better than to just shirk all of their responsibilities to the family and go off on some meditation retreat. Now, this is a real slur. They often say, oh, well, the servants will do all the cooking and somebody else will take care of the kids and so on. They thereby minimize the rigors of a meditation retreat, which are considerable. But the real point is that, yes, I agree with you. I think for many women, it feels like liberation, which in fact meditation should feel like. But anyway, we talked about autonomy, and I talked about how this is prized among males, but women should be subordinate. And one of the things that subordinates, one of the obligations, but you could also think of it as a privilege for subordinates, such as women, is that they can engage with the world much more fulsomely. They can have attachments. They should have attachments. And this is, of course, an obligation. They have to take after the kids, look after the kids. They have to cook the food. They have to serve it to the male members of the household, so on and so forth. And it is a male privilege to not pay a lot of attention to the kids, to go off and fulfill their own autonomy in various ways. But I think there's a cost. The cost is you don't have nearly as warm a relationship with your children. You're not as deeply attached to your kin. I don't want to say one option is the right one and the other is the wrong one. Not at all. I just want to say they're trade-offs. As a contemporary Western male, I'm a big proponent for attachments. But that's just me. I'm not going to say that Burmese men are wrong for prizing their autonomy and women are right for prizing their attachments. But it is a system that divvies up obligations and privileges. And a woman who goes off on meditation retreat, it's only 10 days. She's breaking attachments for 10 days. And some people think a woman should never break her attachments. And in fact, the very complicated, ambivalent responses Burmans have to nuns, to Buddhist nuns, I think follows from that fact. On the one hand, yes, every Buddhist should break their attachments, and we should respect them whenever they do so. At the same time, women need to be invested in their attachments. Women should not be breaking their attachments. So what do you do about a Buddhist nun? And the attitudes are very contradictory and ambivalent.
All this discussion about prestige and gender in Buddhist Burma as taking place on a continuum of autonomy and attachment kind of comes together at the end of your book when you bring in nirvana. So you call this the great chain of Burman Buddhist being. What is this chain? How does nirvana fit into it?
If you think of the continuum between autonomy at one end and attachment at the other, we tend to think of any kind of spectrum like that as horizontal. And I would say, no, in any hierarchical understanding, everything is always vertical. Autonomy is at the top, attachment is at the bottom. Nirvana is the ultimate autonomy. It's the ultimate dissolution of all attachments because there's nothing to attach. There's no self, right? So as you come down that spectrum, you find ever lesser degrees of autonomy, ever greater degrees of attachment. And that goes through from, the ultimate dissolution through the greatest paragons of detachment, which would certainly be the Buddha. These individuals that Guillaume Rosenberg, in his fabulous book, The Immortals, talks about, the Weisa, usually translated as wizards. They're not quite the Buddha, but they're pretty close. They are meditating forever, waiting for the next Buddha to arrive. And then eventually you come down to actual living humans who are the most powerful abbots, and then you progress down through monks and novices and nuns. In theory, they should be respected for their spiritual accomplishments. And then you get down to the men and women, trans women, and then various forms of animal life, and on down. And we know about reincarnation that if your accumulation of demerits is too great, then you will be reborn not as a person at all, but as some sort of beast or bug or whatever.
And that, conceptualizes nirvana as this ideal of ultimate autonomy, and also a consequence of that is that a meritorious rebirth will always be more autonomous than your previous one.
Yes, that's right. So that's why if you are a woman in this world and you accumulate a great deal of merit, you will be reborn male. There is this ongoing debate about whether we should look upon Burmese women as enjoying high status or not. It's conventional wisdom to say that Burmese women enjoy relatively high status. And the contrast that's being drawn is between their position in Burman society versus the position of women in South Asia or in East Asia. In these patrilineal societies, women really do not get a fair deal at all. In most of Southeast Asia, not all of it, is bilateral kinship. There's not much greater value placed on having sons than having daughters. But some female scholars have said this business about the high status of women in Burma is nonsense. Women are very much discriminated against. There's enormous amounts of misogyny, so on and so forth. And my position is all of the above, which is to say, that women in Burma certainly enjoy greater degrees of autonomy than they do in patrilineal societies, certainly in South Asia and East Asia. At the same time, despite their relative degree of autonomy, they are definitely granted less prestige than men. And that means their obligations and privileges are different from men's. In many ways, we would have to say that a man's position is more enviable than a woman's. On the other hand, there are always trade-offs, such as I was saying earlier, that women get to enjoy their attachments in a way that it is often somewhat unbecoming for men to invest in. The very fact that women are usually thought to be better able to handle finances, and therefore money should be under her control, not his, in a household. Is that an obligation or a privilege? Well, ideologically, normatively, to deal with money is sullying. If you're interested in money, you're invested in it, you're attached to it, and you're attached to material concerns, which you shouldn't be. It compromises your status. That's why monks should never touch money. And a woman, women, of course, they're interested in material stuff, and so they can handle money. They don't have as much status to lose by handling money, so sure, go ahead. Now, I don't want to pretend that there aren't women that object to all of this. There certainly are. But the argument is who's fulfilling their obligations appropriately and adequately. And a lot of men don't. That's clear. They gamble, they drink, they womanize, they, so on and so forth. And women complain vociferously about that, and everybody would agree with them. It doesn't mean that women necessarily reject the entire system. They don't necessarily say, of course my husband should be washing just as many clothes, including mine, as I wash. No. They would think that was really throwing everything off. So in a hierarchical arrangement, it isn't as though everybody's happy and accepts the idea that knowing your place is what everybody should do. And they do think that you should know your place, but that doesn't mean that they're happy with the way things are. There's plenty of contestation, but there isn't quite what outsiders describe as resistance. At least what I infer from people's discussion of resistance is rejecting the entire system, not just your place in it or how people are behaving within it.
Thanks, Ward. That's a good spot to move on to recommendations. But I really can't stress enough just how excellent your book is for outsiders trying to understand the things that they find challenging when they live in Myanmar, the different kinds of social relations and how to make sense of them, especially if you're from the Western world or a society with a dominant egalitarian ideology. It's really challenging stuff, and your book really helps us understand how hierarchy is thought about and influences society, and not just Bama Buddhist society, I would say, but, the dominant society in Myanmar, because Bama Buddhism is the majority religion and the majority ethnicity. So this stuff influences the entire country. Yeah. All right. So on to recommendations. Have you brought anything along for us? It can be anything to do with Myanmar. It can be a restaurant. It can be a textbook.
Yes, although it will come off as shameless self-advertising. Nevertheless, I would like to recommend a 2-CD set of Burmese theater music that I produced. It's called AIMP, Archives Internationales de Musique Populaire, out of the Ethnography Museum in Geneva, Switzerland. They have a whole ethnomusicological recording series. And it's 2 CDs, as I say, of Burmese classical musicians. The brilliant ethnomusicologist Filip Jampolsky came. He works in Indonesia, but I knew how good he was at making recordings. He came and made terrific recordings despite the challenges of recording Burmese music. So it's both vocal and instrumental music, and I write pretty thorough notes to help listeners understand what they're hearing. It's a musical tradition unlike any other musical tradition in the world. It's very little known, and it's almost gone. So I really, I apologize for tooting my own horn, but it isn't actually my own horn at all. I just produced it and really think it deserves a wider audience than it gets.
That's great, Ward. I hope people go and seek that out. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's been a great pleasure, Luke. Thanks very much for having me on.